time to get started here. Welcome to Human. I'm here with Bob Grenier. Very pleased that you're with us, Bob. Bob is a veteran of the CIA. He spent 27 years there. He was the director for counterterrorism in the agency. He is an expert on Iran as well as Iraq. He tells me that back in the 80s, he started collecting intelligence on Iran. And of course, this comes after the U.S. began Operation Epic Fury over the weekend. And now, today, we're hearing that the military says that about 1,700 targets have been attacked since Saturday. President Trump saying, quote, "It was my opinion they were going to attack first, not intelligence, but opinion here." So let's get started, Bob. Thank you for joining me. I'm curious to learn what your perspective is when you learn about this operation on Saturday. I know that for me, because I don't sleep very well, I woke up at 4 a.m. I was
Mm.
checking my phone and I saw that we had started striking Iran. Given your background, what were your immediate thoughts?
Well, I guess my initial thought was, here we go again. I've been involved during the course of my career, my professional career, in a number of wars, most prominently in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And to say the very least, they were very challenging. And it did not seem to me as though we had an imminent need to go to war with Iran at the current time. And so I have to say, I was not happy to see this development.
Hmm. And what about right now? Or do you still have that sense of malaise?
Yeah, very much. Again, I see this as a war of choice, not a war of necessity. The rationale that is being given for the war, the various rationales, I don't think hold up particularly well. And we can talk about that in some detail. But I don't think that the U.S. is in great danger of ending up in a quagmire, the endless regime change war, as it's often referred to. We're not going to be, I'm virtually certain, we're not going to be introducing troops on the ground in Iran. So we're not going to be tied to Iran in the way that we were, for instance, in Afghanistan and in
Right, but
Iraq.
hey, let's
Um,
keep in mind that the Secretary of Defense or War, whatever you want to call it, Pete
yeah.
Hegseth, wouldn't rule out boots on the ground and said that we'll essentially do whatever it takes, right?
Well, I think he will do whatever he's commanded. And I think both he and President Trump have been very careful not to take anything off the table.
Right.
But and God knows, uh, there have been any number of times, a great many times, when I have made predictions concerning President Trump that have turned out to be flat wrong. But from all that we have seen, from what we do know about his background, his proclivities, I do not think that he's going to introduce U.S. troops on the ground in Iran. And in fact, if he were to decide later on today that we had achieved all of our objectives, he was declaring victory, and he was withdrawing our military assets from the region, I would not be surprised. And I think that he could easily characterize what he has done thus far as a victory, irrespective of whether the rest of us would agree.
So, you're using some of the similar wording to what Senator Mark Warner, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, used just a few days ago, that this is a war of choice. And there have been a lot of different statements that members of the Trump administration have used. I do want to get into that. But
Mhm.
first, can we step into the mind of Iran's regime? Because whatever it was that compelled the United States to start this with Israel, here we are. And the
Mhm.
real question is, what happens now? What happens next? So, officials in the Trump administration have described this as an important way to stop Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile program. When the dust clears, is this ultimately going to incentivize Iranians to build faster, stronger, better, and more secretly because of what we're seeing right now?
Well, it certainly would motivate them in that direction, no question about it. I think that, we suspect that they have long since been convinced that the only way to get immunity for themselves, to protect themselves from a power like the United States or Israel, for that matter, which has a preponderance of conventional military force, is to get a nuclear weapon. The question is, are they able to do it? Are they able to do it secretly in a way uh, that would preclude their being struck in some sort of a preemptive strike, which is what they're undergoing right now. So I think they will have every motivation to do precisely what you're describing, but I don't think that they will be in a practical position to do it for quite some time. So I'm not sure in among this target set of 1,700 strikes that you've just mentioned, how many of them have been against erstwhile nuclear targets. I suspect that there have been some strikes against nuclear targets. We know that they were very, very heavily damaged before. It'd be very difficult for the Iranians to bring them back online. I'm not at all sure that they've been able to make real progress in trying to bring them online in the interim. So yeah, at the level of motivation, absolutely, just further underscores that the need that has been demonstrated by North Korea, among others, that if you want to gain immunity from American attack, you've got to get a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, absolutely wondering about what US adversaries are seeing and concluding right now. And in terms of nuclear facilities, the International Atomic Energy Agency had said that the entry of Natanz, a nuclear
Hmm.
facility, was bombed. So much to keep track of here. Um, you know, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Iran is producing 100 ballistic missiles per month, thousands of one way attack drones to protect their nuclear program, approaching a point of immunity within a year to a year and a half. Um, and I've also been told that we'll just keep destroying Iran's missiles and their nuclear program if they try to rebuild. Is it realistic to think that the CIA, the National Geospatial Intel Agency, the NSA, all of them, and Israel will be able to continue to so closely monitor Iran after this period of war ends?
Yeah, well, obviously, the combined intelligence capabilities of the Israelis and the Americans are quite formidable. That said, the longer you go, depending on your intelligence capabilities, the greater the chance that eventually you're going to make a serious mistake. And what comes immediately to mind is what happened in Gaza. They thought they had full command of what was going on in Gaza, that not a sparrow could fall without their knowing about it, and yet the Hamas was able to make advanced preparations for their cross-border attack without the Israelis fully realizing it, to the extent that they redeployed their rapid reaction force from around Gaza to the West Bank, leaving themselves tremendously vulnerable in the process. So
And I think part of
there's
it
always the
also had to
opportunity
do with,
for errors. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, as you continuing on with what you're saying, part of it was also that they felt confident in their ability. They couldn't imagine that Hamas would be able to do something like this. So it seemed almost like it was a lack of imagination over Hamas's capabilities. I wonder if that is something that Israel and the U.S. thinks about Iran, whereas it seems to be more in the other direction, that Israel and the United States think that Iran is fully capable, and others believe, why are we here yet? This isn't the time. There was no imminence here. And there are even debates on the intentionality of Iran's nuclear
Mhm,
inclinations and
mhm.
whether or not those are there.
Yeah. So I think as a long-term desideratum, all things equal, I
Wait,
think the
what is
Iranian.
that word? Let's we
That is,
shouldn't use that word.
I knew you were going to stop me. I knew you were. Yes, as a
I'm gonna
long-term.
write this down for the SATs because yeah, but
Sorry.
Ziterata, go for it.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. The As a long-term desire, um, the obviously, all things equal, the Iranians would love to have a nuclear weapon. I don't think there's any question about that, and I don't think that is limited to the clerical regime. I think any Iranian nationalist would want to have the capability of defending the country. Um, but I think that the issue is at what cost, and I think it's been very clear for a couple of decades now that the Iranians were willing to forego the ability, at least in the near term, to have nuclear weapons in favor of getting sanctions relief. And that was the essence of the deal that was struck under the Obama administration. That was the essence of the deal that was undone then by President Trump in his first term. And I think that all things equal, it is a deal that they would accept right now, but they would always want, if at all possible, to maintain the capability, the long-term capability, against the day when they decide to exercise it to enrich uranium and ultimately to produce a nuclear weapon, if they feel that that continues to be necessary for their national survival.
I mean, in these days since the beginning of this operation, we've been getting bits and pieces from various officials. And Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said yesterday that in the first meeting with the Iranians, they told the United States directly that they had control of 460 kilograms, 60% enriched uranium, and they were aware that they could prepare 11 nuclear bombs. Quote, that was the beginning of their negotiating stance, and they were proud of it. Trump, of course, goes on to say we were having to negotiations with these lunatics, which is a very Trumpian way of
Mm,
describing the situation. But it's also a question of trust. I mean, we saw this even back in the Obama days with the JCPOA. How much can you
mhm,
really trust of what the Iranians say? And remember that break-in to the warehouse in Tehran back in 2018 that Mossad conducted, where they were able to obtain the blueprints for a nuclear weapon. And then Netanyahu makes a big scene,
mhm,
stands up in English and announces that Iran has been deceiving the world. And then Trump pulls the United States out of the nuclear agreement. So, how much can the Iranians be trusted, as these negotiations happen?
mm, mm.
Diplomacy is obviously an important area. We don't have USAID anymore to rely on. Tell me your thoughts on that before I take us back to CIA.
Yeah, well, I think back to Ronald Reagan, who always said that you trust but verify. And we weren't dependent entirely on trust regarding the Iranian willingness to follow through on their commitments under the JCPOA. We had the IAEA that was conducting regular inspections there. And they have consistently said that the Iranians were, in fact, meeting their obligations under that agreement. And in fact, they continued to meet their obligations under the agreement, even after Trump unilaterally abrogated the agreement in hopes that they would have an opportunity through the influence of the Europeans and perhaps otherwise to get back to that agreement because they felt that it actually served their interests at
And
the time. So
do you
go
think
ahead.
that if I know I'm cutting you off, but just because I'm wondering if we had stuck to that agreement, do you think we would be in a place of imminence right now where Iran is so close to having the ability to have a nuclear weapon and has
Well,
been strengthening its ballistic missile program?
yeah, well. I mean, let's be a little bit careful here. So the Iranians, and this is news to me. So Steve Witkoff, talking about how the Iranians were pleased to inform him about the amount of 60% enriched uranium that they had. Um, However, they were no longer in a position to further enrich that uranium because their centrifuge system had been incapacitated. How quickly they could set that up, et cetera, and how capable they would be of reestablishing that enrichment capability without the Americans, the Israelis, and others knowing about it, very much an open question. But to circle back and answer another part of your question, we would not be in a situation right now, presumably, where the Iranians had that volume of 60% enriched uranium. They were enriching much smaller quantities of uranium to a much lower purity level before under the terms of the JCPOA. JCPOA, and so it was only after they decided that, well, look, we're not going to be able to reestablish the JCPOA. We're not going to be able to get out from under these renewed sanctions that the Americans have imposed on us, and so we the Iranians need to exact a cost for that. And so they said, okay, fine, you don't want to have an agreement with us. We're no longer under an obligation to greatly limit our enrichment of uranium. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to enrich it to 60%. See how you like that. And that puts us closer than if we made the decision to make a rush forward to enrich up to weapons level, weapons grade. So this is the cat and mouse that we've been involved in here. And, it's I think one of the things to remind ourselves here is that, and we dealt with this in the case of Iraq before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and that is that once a country has developed the the intellectual capability, once they have the knowledge to create weapons of mass destruction, most importantly, nuclear weapons. There's no taking that away. You can take away their equipment, you can take away their stocks of uranium, but they have the knowledge and the know-how. And once they gain the ability to 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 realize that industrially, if you will, they're always going to pose a potential threat. There's simply no way around that. And so the issue is to manage it. And one of the things that sort of a difference in approach right now that we're seeing between Trump on the one hand and Netanyahu on the other is that Netanyahu, in the context of Iran, as with Hezbollah, as with Hamas, he's looking for millennial solutions. He's looking for an ultimate final solution to the problem. And in his mind, it's absolutely necessary, one way or another, sooner or later, to change the regime in Iran. That so long as we have an Islamic Republic, so long as radical Shiite clerics are ruling that country, they're going to have a continuing problem that they're going to have to manage.
Right. And so you bring up what is a good point of ideology, that it
Mhm.
is not just about knowledge, but it's about motivation. And
Right.
if we're talking about the Islamic Republic, they will be motivated to continue to develop ballistic missiles, drones, as well as a nuclear program.
Mhm.
And that takes me into this question of what Netanyahu wants and what the Trump administration has also discussed at point come next in terms of leading the country now that the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been killed. Um, you know, what Trump told reporters today was, quote, most of the people we had in mind are dead. In a situation like this, it's very common for the CIA to look for allies, to look for successors. Would they be doing that retroactively with so many people who have now been decapitated? Would they be playing a role in this point? I mean, and how frantically would they be doing that? Or are where it's just totally out of our hands?
I think it's totally out of our hands. Really, when I hear Trump say that, my reaction is to say, as if, we're not going to be choosing the next leadership in Iran. Certainly not under the current circumstances. And the Islamic Republic of Iran, it has a very elaborated system. There was no time at all after the death of Khamenei that you had the naming of the three-person leadership council. They have governance. Uh, the means by which a new supreme leader is chosen is very well established. Now, whether as a practical matter they can get the council of experts to meet to elect a new leader in the near future, that's another question. That they may have to put that off for some time. But it's a very deep regime. We are told, I don't know if it's true, but we're told that before his death, and interestingly, there was some element, I think, of personal volition in his. He clearly Khamenei could have protected himself better. there are some who argue persuasively that he was quite willing to be martyred at this point. But in any case, before he left, we're told that he had people in key positions within Iran, many of whom, some 40 of whom, we're told were killed at about the same time that he was. That they should have a succession plan down 3 and sometimes 4 layers deep. And apparently that's what they've done. So now it's going to be command and control is going to be much more difficult for them, much more difficult for different elements in the leadership to consult with one another. Um, but they still have a leadership structure. And you may have different elements having to operate more independently, but they're still there. They're still making decisions, and they're still carrying on the war.
I mean, the idea that he was sort of nonchalant about his own death is an interesting point. When the New York Times broke the news of the CIA tracking his whereabouts, growing more
Mm,
confident with each step, it felt
mm,
like this was a reference to a human source. I believe it was the Financial Times who then reported that it was a human source.
mm.
And so that implies that there's somebody very, very close to Khamenei, who betrayed him, who may or may not be alive right now. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other flows of intelligence that were coming in. Of course, the Israelis also had their own information here.
Mhm.
Um, but I find that to be a fascinating development in all of this, because now these new leaders have to be concerned about their own physical safety. And how do you maintain control when you also have to be so careful about all of your movements and how you communicate?
It's very, very difficult. And modern means of communication, as we all know, carry with them tremendous vulnerabilities. And so, the need to communicate with one another is what raises their vulnerabilities exponentially. So, and that in turn requires a great deal of discipline. So, what we were told after after the devastating Israeli attacks, the decapitation attacks that took place in the context of the 12-day war, was that they knew they knew individuals who were in the respective security um, teams of the various figures. And while they themselves were being very careful in terms of how the principals were communicating, members of their respective security teams were not being nearly as careful. They had their own phones, they were communicating with families, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, it was by tracking those individuals that the Israelis were then able to launch such devastating strikes. So it's just a way of underscoring that in the present day and time, it takes a tremendous amount of deep discipline, not only on the part of the leaders themselves, but on the part of their entourages, their families, et cetera, in order to hide their whereabouts and to thwart efforts to track them down and to strike them. So it is not an easy thing
And it
at all.
seems as though, remember when Hegseth called back all of the generals and was going to make an announcement, and we were all wondering, what's he going to say? What's he going to say?
Right.
And what he said is, essentially, FOFA, fuck off or find out.
Mhm.
And that's sort of almost, or sorry, I think I messed that up. It's
It-
fuck
yeah,
around and find
and
out.
find out.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
The alphabet. It's very confusing. Um, but so so in a way, this also sends a message of fear to other Iranians. If you don't negotiate with us in a way that we like, then maybe we'll come after you too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. And as has been pointed out in recent days, martyrdom is an important element in this regime. And those who are the most ideologically motivated are the ones who are most willing to embrace martyrdom. Of course, it's completely speculative at this point. But it seems to me that it is at least plausible that Khamenei, having reached this point in his life, 86 years old, failing, ailing, having a very robust structure under him, and tired of. He was the nickname for him in Iran was Ali the Mouse, because he was not appearing in public. He was constantly underground, constantly hiding, and I suspect that he part of it perhaps was that he got sick of the indignity of doing that. Wasn't willing to do it anymore, and realized that the chances were relatively high that he would be struck as a result. That's complete speculation, but I would not be terribly surprised. And in fact, one of the things that he has said on many occasions was that he would expect someday to embrace martyrdom.
Hmm. So in a way, the US was fulfilling a legacy for him.
Fulfilling a long-term desire, perhaps. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
One of the things that's interesting, you were talking about motivations for the U.S. And one of the things that Trump has said on several occasions now, and perhaps others as well, is that, well, we had no choice, that we knew that the Iranians were going to strike us. And that was, in fact, you just mentioned that. And I don't think that's based on intelligence. I think that's just based on an understanding that if and when the Israelis struck them, that the Iranians would part of an important part of their response would be to attack U.S. targets, which in turn would force us to attack them in response. And just the other day, Secretary Rubio said something which greatly surprised me, in that he said, "Well, we knew the Israelis were going to strike, and that we would be more vulnerable to an Iranian response if we didn't strike first ourselves."
Mhm.
And so that is a very clear admission, a declaration that President Trump was willing to be manipulated by the Israelis using American weapons and forcing him thereby to do something that he might not want to do otherwise. And
And yet
particularly
then
in
t yeah, oh,
go
well, I
ahead.
was gonna say, but then today, Trump came out saying the reverse, right? That it would be Israel coming along on the ride and undermining what Rubio said in that moment.
Okay, I hadn't seen that. It
It's like
changes constantly,
there's
but
yeah, there is not a consistent message. Each person seems to be hitting on a different point, which has made it confusing.
well, yeah, and again, there's a personality leadership dynamic here, because what surprised me when Rubio said that was that I couldn't have imagined that that would have made Trump happy, because Trump is supposed to be the master of his own fate. Trump is the one who dictates to others, not for others to dictate to him. And they were not at all shy about indicating, when they forced the Israelis to accept, uh, in the end, two different ceasefires with Hamas, that it was the U.S. that demanded that, and Israel had to follow through. You remember at the end of the so-called 12-day war, when the Israelis continued to strike targets in Iran, and the president got furious, and I think I promised I wasn't going to use the F word. I was going to leave that to you and the
Oh,
division
fuck
of
it.
labor. But
Just use it, Bob. Fuck it.
but well, it's not me saying this; it's the president. But he said, I think they need to stop fucking around. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so again, he's supposed to be the boss here. He's
Right.
supposed to be the master of his own fate. And so I guess I'm not terribly surprised to see him at least trying to double back on what Rubio has said. And that's an important aspect of the dynamic here, I think.
I also think that there is a question here of perception and saving face and reputation that comes into play, not just of Trump, but of Netanyahu and others. And there have been some interesting messagings or messages that I've seen on social media where experts have described some concern that maybe that is also at play. But at the same time, I think that there are some people who see Iran as this evergreen threat, and that because this was a moment of weakness for the country on many different levels,
Right.
this moment would be easier to harm the country in these substantive ways than, say, 6 months from now, even 3 months from now. I mean,
Mhm.
despite the fact that Trump claimed that the US strikes in June obliterated Iran's nuclear program, he has said that they were rebuilding. We know that there were some facilities that stayed intact. And so this was escalating, and there have been some sighs of relief that something has been done because this is a problem that has been escalating. Like, don't you think that at some point in the years ahead, we'll be having the same conversation about a country like North Korea as they have continued to be a problem that just gets pushed to the side, different administrations trying different approaches with no success?
Mm. Well, I think that right now the challenge posed by North Korea and the challenge posed by Iran are qualitatively different. But in a sense, that's the whole point, because the North Koreans have nuclear weapons and the Iranians don't. But I like your phrase that Iran poses an evergreen threat, and I think that's just the point. Now, I think it's very clear that the Iranian nuclear program, such as it is right now, does not pose an imminent threat.
Mhm.
Far from it at this point. Um, uh, but if Secretary Rubio is correct, and he may not be far off, that the Iranians remain capable of constructing large numbers of ballistic missiles in a relatively short period of time, they're able to build new launchers, et cetera, that you're right, you're in a qualitatively easier place right now if your ultimate intent is going to be to strike them, to do it now rather than to wait 3 months from now or 6 months from now. Uh, the, the question is, does this really help you? Is this really a part of the long term solution or not? And I think that that is very highly questionable.
Mhm.
We'll see how everything plays out. But one of the things that is being pointed out is that as the Iranians are husbanding their resources, as they are modulating the frequency with which they launch missiles, launching drones obviously is much easier, and of course the Gulf Arab countries are much more vulnerable to those drones than, for instance, is Israel. They can probably continue. The Iranians can continue to strike those targets on the Arabian side of the Gulf for quite some time, and the interceptors that are necessary to shoot them down are far more expensive, much more dear than are the projectiles that they're being employed against. So
I think
the
that they
Iranians may be able to carry this out for quite some time.
Mhm. I think the only distinction is that they can't replenish what they decide to launch right now because there's
That's right.
been so much damage. And one place that the United States and Israel has targeted beyond the infrastructure that supports the manufacturing of ballistic missiles, et cetera, are intelligence offices and detention centers. What is the logic in targeting those locations in addition to what has already been hit in your view?
Yeah, but my suspicion is that it's the Israelis who are in the division of labor, are taking the lead in striking elements of the regime that are part of the repressive infrastructure, if you will. So you say, well, why in God's name are they striking police stations? Well, if you're trying to remove the means by which the regime can maintain security against a hostile population, those are among the targets that you hit. And we see the Israelis doing that. And so I think it underscores again one of the points that we were making earlier, which is that regime change as an end goal at this point is far more important to the Israelis. The Israelis are looking for some kind of a permanent solution here. I think that a regime change for the Trump administration is a nice to have, something that we would like, but not a core motivation for the war. Not something that would have to be achieved in order for the U.S. to declare victory and go home. And uh, I, I, and I think that Trump is not about to take responsibility for regime change. I think he's made that very clear from the outset. What he said to the Iranian people is, I'm the only American president who's giving you what you want. So I've killed Khamenei. I've struck the regime. Once I'm done, then it's over to you.
Right.
You need to take this opportunity. But again, the Americans are not going to take responsibility for doing this. And if the uh, the Iranian population, in his words, don't rise to the occasion, don't seize this opportunity, I don't think that he's going to feel that that reflects on him.
Yeah. Right, right. That's an interesting approach. I mean, one thing that I've thought is that Venezuela is kind of about regime modification, not regime change. And there is a sense of, is that possible here? Well, it doesn't really seem very possible here. But if you're not giving a roadmap to the everyday person, like you don't have an al Shara who's just ripping through the country, who has all the ability to topple a regime like Assad. That happened
Right.
organically, and we don't have a moment like that.
And it was many years in the making, mind you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so no,
absolutely.
there's no organized opposition within Iran now. The Iranian regime is is at the weakest point it's ever been in its 47-year history. I don't think there's any question about that. And so, is it impossible for it to be toppled? I wouldn't say that at all. I don't think it's going to happen in the near term, however. There just isn't anybody else who can step in. And as for whether we could see a Venezuela-like solution here from a U.S. policy standpoint, I think absolutely we could. Um, you know, if you take a look at what we think we know, what has been revealed about the demands that the U.S. was making in the context of the recent negotiations with Iran, essentially what we were telling them is you have to unilaterally disarm. We were saying, not only do you have to put off the construction of a nuclear weapon, we want a regime whereby you can never have a nuclear weapon. You will never have enrichment capability, et cetera, et cetera. You need to accept limits on your ballistic missile capabilities. Now, we don't know what those limits were. Trump said falsely in recent days that the Iranians were in a position where they could ultimately launch intercontinental ballistic missiles against the United States. Wrong. It's just wrong. I mean, the experts who know the most about this are saying that it would take a solid decade for the Iranians to get to that point if they made the decision now that that's what they wanted to do. So whatever else you may want to say about it, I don't dismiss it as a long range threat, but it's certainly not an imminent threat. So, what were the limits that we were going to impose on those? I suspect that with those limits, whatever they were, would not have protected Bahrain, but might very well have protected Israel.
Mm.
So, if that's the case, then essentially you're saying to the Iranians, we are insisting that you put yourself in a position where you are ultimately vulnerable to the Israelis under circumstances where you can't do anything about it. Oh, and by the way, your indirect means of projecting power, that is through the so-called surrogates, we need you to cut off your relationships with them as well. So essentially, we were asking them in every manner possible to unilaterally disarm. And so essentially, what I think we are doing with these attacks is to say, okay, you won't agree to unilaterally disarm, we're going to take away your capability, whether it's nuclear, whether it's missile, whether it's the Navy. And in fact, Secretary Hegseth made that very clear just the other day. He said, we are removing the Iranians' ability to project power beyond their own borders. Now, we can't do that permanently, but that's what we're setting about to do right now.
Absolutely correct in that is what he said. And I want to talk about the drone program. I want to talk about the neighborhood. I'm announcing right now to people who are not watching this live, but people watching the recording, that this is where the free portion is going to end. This is how I do my job. I can only do it with paid subscribers. I work really hard. This is a fire hose. When wars happen, it is just a stream of information to stay on top of. So if you want to get the rest of this recording, please support me and become a paid subscriber. And now we continue with Bob Grenier, a former CIA officer of 27 years who was the director of the Counterterrorism Center. We are talking about the war in Iran. And can we talk a little bit about the drone program, which has been established for years, has been very successful for them. They lent them to Russia. The Ukrainians have experience with them. Do you think that the United States or Israel or any of the neighboring countries right now are turning to the Ukrainians who have experience, especially with the Shahed drones?
Yeah, I don't have any insight into that at all. But what I would say which is pretty obvious, is that the state of the art has been very much developed and perfected by the Ukrainians. That they're in the forefront right now, and I'm sure that the U.S., all of the major militaries around the world, are taking lessons from them
Right,
right
but
now,
we're talking about counter drone technology, which is different
right,
than
and that
drone
too.
technology.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, both sides of the coin are extremely important. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that the state of the art is being further developed and refined every day, and I'm sure, without having inside knowledge, that the U.S., among others, are learning lessons from them
Mhm.
constantly. And I now, the fact that we are no longer directly providing them with weapons, we're doing it via the Europeans and NATO as a cutout, is perhaps attenuated a little bit our tactical level contacts with the Ukrainians. But I strongly suspect that there's a lot of knowledge transfer that's taking place.
And Zelensky has expressed some concern that this situation could affect weapons deliveries for their defense against Russia. Moving forward, can you give me a sense, as a person who has spent time looking at terrorism, Iran, why Iran would have targeted a British base in Cyprus before the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that they would support the US by allowing them to use bases, and Cyprus isn't one of those bases. What was the logic behind that? And I mean, at the same time, why is the Iranian missiles also hitting a hotel here, a hotel there, which goes beyond U.S. bases and then starts to make enemies of neighbors?
Yeah, well, this is I think a difficult calculation that the Iranians are having to make and to refine over time. So, as we know in the early stages, and I may have the sequence wrong here, so please correct me if you know otherwise. But early on, the British said that no, you can't use our UK bases in order to launch long range aircraft. You can't use our base at Diego Garcia to strike at Iran. They wanted to stay out of it. Apparently, and I believe it was after he backed off that, and that he decided that yes, there were certain defensive capabilities, however you define that in the current environment, that he would make available to the U.S. It was only after that, I think, that the Iranians decided that they would strike this base in Cyprus. A little bit far afield. I wouldn't have thought it was on the at the top of the strike list, but I think that was the idea, and I think that what the Iranians are doing vis-a-vis the Arab countries, and they've struck some 12 of them now, uh, uh, falls in a number of different buckets. So on the one hand, they're saying most broadly, look, you were aligned with the Americans, you were providing the Americans with basing rights in your countries, therefore that puts you on the other side of the line, and and we feel free to strike you. I think also, though, and much more importantly, they want to exert pressure. They want to inflict as much pain as broadly as they possibly can, particularly economic pain. So much of what they're doing right now is
Closing of the
designed to get
Strait of Hormuz, right? I mean, what happens with
absolutely,
that? Hmm.
absolutely. And so we're seeing a sharp increase in hydrocarbon prices, particularly gas prices right now. And I think those who are reliant on guttery liquefied natural gas are particularly vulnerable in that respect. But India, I think, gets 50% of its crude oil requirements through the Straits of Hormuz. The Chinese, something on the order of a third. So, and we could drill into that because I think that the Chinese have managed to build up very large
Yeah,
crude
well,
oil
we'll get to
stocks that could
China.
last
We'll
them for
get to
some time.
China. Yeah.
We'll get there, but. But yeah, the Iranians need to hit all of the key pain points, so that others will be motivated to weigh on the United States and to influence the United States to back off this war.
And
So
yet we're
there's
seeing some very interesting responses from other countries, right? I mean, Qatar said that its military, its air force, shot down aircraft, intercepted ballistic missiles and drones. And Qatar is a country that has prided itself on staying neutral and being
Hmm.
a place where negotiations can happen between the Taliban and Hamas and all of these different actors.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think one of the big points to make here is I think you're suggesting, the near term reaction of many of these countries that have wanted at least to appear to be staying on the fence and staying out of the fight. Now that they are coming under attack themselves, the Saudis, the UAE, Qataris, Kuwaitis, and others, that if anything, this is causing them to consolidate in terms of the relations, not only with one another, but also with the United States. We now have an active common enemy here. So,
So will this
in a
wrap
sense,
up
that works a
in
little bit in the other direction from what the Iranians intend.
right? Yeah, I can see that. With the length of time that this war goes on, and of course, members of the administration who are very careful about even using the word war, lest that bring in Congress and its opinion. Um, but however long this goes on, having all of these other countries involved, does that risk prolonging the war even when the United States and Israel stop its own strikes?
Well, that's an extremely important point, because let's just say that for a number of reasons that we could easily outline, a week from today, Trump decides, okay, fine, time to declare victory. That I gave them the opportunity to unilaterally disarm in the way that I analyze it, and so since they wouldn't do that, we've had to hit them and take their capabilities away. We've done that, and so now we're prepared to withdraw. Um, the Iranians in that situation, if they still have the capability of striking their neighbors, as they may well have, they may have an incentive to carry on and to continue to impede hydrocarbon exports from the region, uh, unless and until the U.S. and others lift economic sanctions on them. At that point, why would they stop? If they had the ability to continue. I mean, there were lots of reasons why they wouldn't have struck against their neighbors in the first place, but they've crossed that Rubicon, you know, days ago
Yeah,
now.
that's
So there
daunting,
may be
daunting. Yeah.
there may be a lot of unintended consequences to this, and this war may not be uh, as easy to turn off as it was to turn on.
And let's also talk about Lebanon and Hezbollah now, because the Israelis have now moved into Lebanon.
Hmm.
Hezbollah has retaliated because of the death of Khamenei.
Hmm.
Um, what do you make of that? And how is CIA making assessments on these proxy groups, which have varying levels of support from the Iranian regime?
Yeah, and if you'll just permit me to make a little detour here for a second. One of the things that frankly drives me crazy is the constant reference, and this is not an attack on you, but the constant reference to proxies, because that carries with it the idea that somehow these are inhabitants of the zombie apocalypse. That Iran completely controls what Hezbollah does, it completely controls what Hamas does, completely controls what the Houthis do, and it's simply not true. Now, these are very, very complicated relationships. The Iranians have different degrees, not of control, but of influence over all of these different groups. And I think that since we're looking at this from an intelligence point of view, it's extremely important for intelligence people in particular not to get caught up in the political categories that are often used. So anyway, that's
Okay,
always a
well,
flashpoint for me with,
I hear that, but
right.
let me take that detour with you for a second.
Yeah,
And this isn't me arguing with you, but it's me
yeah.
bringing up as an example,
Hmm.
Defense Intelligence Agency reporting in 2024 that they interdicted 18 vessels between 2015 and 2013. These were weapons that were being sent to the Houthis. We know that the drone program involves breaking down parts and smuggling. So, I
Hmm.
mean, there certainly is a relationship. And when you look at the service members who were killed in Iraq, a lot of them, that was because of Iran. And the Shia militias
Oh,
continue to dominate the country. So,
absolutely. Absolutely. And so, yeah, there are capabilities that have been transferred by the Iranians, either directly or indirectly, in some cases via Lebanese Hezbollah, to these various problematic actors, many of whom have been actively involved in attacks on U.S. service personnel. So you're right. There were a lot of Americans who lost their lives in Iraq during the insurgency there because of explosively formed projectiles that were a result of technology that was either provided directly by the Iranians or provided indirectly via Lebanese Hezbollah. So that is absolutely true, and uh, and obviously that the Iranians have expended a lot of money over decades now to provide capabilities to Lebanese Hezbollah. No question about that. But in any given instance, as in this one, Hezbollah has to make certain judgments as to some of the risk versus gain if they have the temerity to strike against the Israelis, knowing that the Israelis have much greater capabilities than they do. And yeah, for instance, one of the things that really surprised me was the extent to which the Israelis were able to wipe out pretty effectively the missile infrastructure that Hezbollah controlled in South Lebanon. So I thought that Hezbollah would pose a much greater threat to Israel than, in fact, it proved to do when they actually did get into open-ended warfare there. But yeah, so in this instance, we saw that Hezbollah did not immediately jump into the fray. But once it was announced that Khamenei was killed, then for whatever combination of internal politics was at work there, they decided that they couldn't simply allow that to pass without a response, and so that they started striking against Israel. And now that appears to have taken on its own dynamic. I had thought that Hezbollah would try to limit their engagement with with Israel in hopes that Israel would exercise similar restraint. I'm not exactly sure how that evolution has taken place, but it's taken place very rapidly. And as you say, the Israelis are going pretty much all out to the extent that they can, given the fact that they're fighting another major war simultaneously. But they're striking targets in South Beirut. They're striking targets all over the south. They move troops across the border so that they can preclude Fedayeen attacks from the south. So yeah, I think we're back in full blown war in Iran. I'm sorry, in Lebanon, all
Mhm.
over again. And
Yeah.
we've already seen public statements from the Lebanese prime minister of a sort that they would not have made even months ago, basically denouncing Hezbollah for
And
bringing the
banning
country into
banning
war.
it. Right. Right.
Mm.
Yeah, that was notable. I mean, it is notable to see what other countries are saying and doing to wrap US efforts here. And um, I mean, when we think specifically about Hezbollah and this what seems to be a red line with the killing of Khamenei, are there
Mm.
other red lines that you foresee being crossed here amongst some of these groups? Notice I didn't say the word proxy, so I get a gold star for that. But we're talking
Yes, you
about
do.
that's good. Now I'm done. I'm done. Guys, we're done. Now, like the Houthis and Hamas and the Shia militias in Iraq. What will
Mm.
be the turning point where they decide we do want to get involved in this in a significant way?
Yeah, that's very hard to say because it seems to me that the two big red lines have already been crossed. I mean, we're in an all out war with Iran, what appears to be and what the Iranians themselves clearly perceive to be an existential conflict. Is not existential for the Israelis. It's certainly not existential for us, but it is existential for the clerical regime. So that red line has been crossed, and the decapitation of the Islamic Republic is a line that has been crossed. Frankly, I would struggle to figure out what the next red line would be if and when the regime were toppled. We can leave that as a question aside as a question. But if and when that were to happen, um, well, you know, I'm not sure that would really be a red line for them to respond to, because frankly, nothing succeeds like success, and nothing fails like failure. And if the Islamic Republic were to fail in a spectacular manner, I think that would disincentivize these so-called proxy groups from responding further
And
against the Americans and or the Israelis.
And quick question on these groups, uh, before we move on, and I'll wrap this up in
Hmm.
like a few minutes, 10 minutes here. But there's so much to talk
Hmm.
about. I mean, we could
Oh,
talk every
absolutely.
single day and not touch on the same thing twice. But
Mm.
what is the network like between them without the regime? I mean, are the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Shia militias in Iraq? Those are the ones I think of off the top of my head, but I'm
Mm.
sure there are more.
Mhm.
Do they communicate, train, share weapons, intelligence? Um, do they have a chance to strengthen one another without Tehran existing as it is?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question, and I can only give you a partial answer to it. I think that among certain elements um, in the I in this alliance, there is a tradition and a history of much closer cooperation. So, for instance, Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, was very actively involved in supporting elements of the Syrian regime. They were very actively involved, along with co-religionists from
Right.
Iraq in
And
particular.
the
Go ahead.
Hezbollah, I believe that the Hezbollah was paid to go into Syria and do that work by Tehran, according to my own reporting, if I remember it correctly. But
Mm.
yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, I think that they had. I don't think they were entirely mercenary, but yeah, I think they had ideological reasons of their own to get involved. But surely that they would have needed and accepted logistical and financial support from Iran to get actively involved there. So yeah, I think that is absolutely right, and I'm sure that there are bonds that, in the context of Syria, were forged between these different elements of the Hashd al-Shab, these Shiite militias that are sponsored and supported by Iran in Iraq, and Lebanese Hezbollah. So there are relations at a tactical level that have been created, and so I wouldn't be at all surprised to see ongoing coordination among them. With the Houthis, uh, um, frankly, I just don't know. I doubt that there's anything like the links that exist between the groups that we've just been talking about, and say Lebanese Hezbollah and the Houthis. Um, so I don't think that there would be that degree of coordination. So I think that the Houthis obviously are watching what's happening. They're making their own determinations as to when they want to get involved and who they're going to strike and when. But I, I, I think that they are sort of a wild card entity in a way that some of the other uh, Shiite groups in the region are not.
mm,
And
all
we
you
could
had
get
to do
into.
was look at the Red Sea to notice that. Um,
Right. Yeah, there is that connection there. And one of the things that I would point out, this whole issue of, who's a proxy, and what does that actually mean in context. Frankly, traditionally there was never very much contact between the Houthis and Iran, and it really wasn't until around 2015 when the Houthis, for reasons that had really nothing to do with rivalry with Saudi Arabia, forged alliances that enabled them to take control of much of the country. That then was seen as a threat by Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis started focusing on the Houthis, and stressing the fact that these were Shia. And it was in response to that development that the Iranians then redoubled their efforts to reach out to the Houthis and to provide them with capabilities that they were not providing them with before. So there was an element of self-fulfilling prophecy in what the Saudis did at the time. And I remember coming out in public and speaking on Al Jazeera and elsewhere to say that the Saudis were making a big mistake.
yeah, and out. And also fascinating to see how these opportunistic moments can completely change the dynamics of the region. And if this Iranian regime falls or weakens, the next question, of course, will be what happens in Saudi, which has always had been sort of like the countering force in the region after we invaded Iraq. Um,
Mhm.
how that ends up influencing what the crown prince thinks, wants, demands, the adjustments that he's made in oil production as all of this takes place to try to
Mhm.
accommodate the United States in its strikes. Um, but as we move forward, I do want to end here on China
Mm.
and whether or not this has repercussions for a future conflict with China or escalations with China in the years ahead. South Korean media has reported that the U.S. is considering relocating systems, Patriot, THAAD. These are important anti missile systems. They are placed the in the region to protect against China. Um, Chinese are expanding a submarine fleet, sea drone fleets, and anti-sub warfare aircraft, according to the Naval Submarine Forces Commander Vice Admiral Richard Seif, who spoke with members
Mm.
of Congress, I believe, yesterday to say this. So while we may be moving military assets out of the region,
Mm.
to support our attack on Iran, China is using its own resources to strengthen its naval efforts. So I
Mhm.
wanted to get your thoughts on this. Now that we're in the midst of this, is it a good idea that these assets move, and
Mm.
or is it going to really come back to haunt us in the future when we think about China?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I guess there were some who would say, well, the fact that we are tactically moving Patriot batteries and other systems away from East Asia, so as to provide us with greater capabilities in the Middle East. Now that we're bogged down in yet another Middle East war, um, I, again, I'm not a China expert. I would defer to others on this. I don't think that increases the immediate near-term likelihood of an Iranian, or rather, of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, for instance, particularly at a time when the Chinese military is in considerable disarray as a result of internal politics and the replacement of a number of senior commanders. Um, but that said, I think it brings up another broader point, and that is that at a time when the U.S. is deprioritizing uh, uh, our alliances, both in Europe and in East Asia, uh, it it puts greater pressure on us as a unilateral military power to literally cover the entire world, and we're simply not in a position to do it. There are noises being made by the Trump administration, as I understand, to go from a defense budget which is just under $1 trillion a year, breathtaking sum, and to raise it by 50% to $1.5 trillion. Um, Again, I'll defer to others on this. We're getting into domestic politics. I don't think that's something that we can afford. But it seems to me that it underscores the fact that we are particularly unwise, in my view, to be deprioritizing the very alliances that make it possible for us to maintain the role that we do in the world without having to take the entire burden upon ourselves. So that's something that I think should concern us greatly. There's also an issue of sort of, of geopolitics here, that as the U.S. is more and more prone to exercise unilateral, if you will, uh, um, um, what's the word that I'm looking for here? Um, uh, Essentially, we're operating as an empire, and as we demonstrate our own willingness and greater ability to operate independently in the world, I think that then further encourages the Russians and the Chinese to behave likewise in their own spheres of influence. So I think you bring all that together in the context of what you're just talking about at a tactical level, movement of weapon systems away from East Asia, and And I think it should give us all a great deal of disquiet.
Yeah. There was a Wall Street Journal piece that cited Foreign Minister Wong saying that essentially that portrays the U.S. as leading, quote, the regression of the world to the law of the jungle. And
Mhm.
it also described how China is able to see what the U.S. is using in terms of its arsenal and
Mhm.
what its tactics are. So that
Mhm.
is another piece that, in a way, U.S. military strategy is on display, and that's a level of intelligence that the Chinese would see very useful.
Yeah, I think it probably cuts two ways, at least. On the one hand, yes, I think they're learning a great deal about the current U.S. means of making war and how to defend against it and how to exploit its vulnerabilities. But at the same time, they're also having a clear graphic demonstration of what U.S. capabilities are, and that may disincentivize them from engaging
Yeah.
in adventures in the East
Yeah.
China Sea in the near
And I
future.
guess, yeah, and there are differences as well because we're talking about, well, we are talking a lot about air, but
Mhm.
with China, that also would very much involve naval activity to a degree that I think would probably be much bigger than what we're seeing with Iran. And
Oh, no doubt.
I wanted I wanted to end on a note about the United States and the threat here from our activity in Iran. There
Mhm.
was this shooting a few days ago in Austin, and the possibility that this shooter did have an allegiance to Iran because this person was wearing a hoodie that said "quote unquote" "property of Allah." There is no clarity on the connection right now, but in your experience. Uh, how closely tied are situations abroad where we are getting involved and Israel is involved to what ends up unfolding here in the United States?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. It's a very fraught issue. Now, from all that we know about this incident in Austin, it was a one off, and we'll find out more about this individual, what his motivations were. But one of the things that we used to talk about back in the day was the extent to which the Iranians might be able to exploit communities in the United States, and particularly Shiite communities in the United States, to form cells, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think it's extremely important that all of us stress incessantly that the vast majority of Muslim Americans in the United States are rock solid, loyal Americans, and there are at least two reasons that we ought not ever to demonize those communities. One is because it's wrong, but secondly, that it's also extremely unwise because if in fact, obviously, I think that if Iran were to form um, terrorist cells in the United States, the most readily exploitable element of our population would be the Shiite population, particularly in Michigan. Um, but that then adds a very practical reason why we ought not to demonize these communities, because the best and indeed the only way of knowing what's happening in those communities is for the members of those communities themselves to be very hyper aware of what's happening with their own community, and not to be in any way dissuaded from coming forward to the FBI, local police, and others as and when that they see something that doesn't look right or that suggests that there's some sort of a threat afoot. So again, I think for a number of reasons, we have to be very, very careful in the way that we talk about this, the way that we think about it. But yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is the possibility of domestic security repercussions here. We have not really seen that, certainly on a systematic basis. We've seen specific individuals who've radicalized one way or another and have committed deplorable acts, but we really haven't seen this on a systematic basis. And in fact, I'm a little bit surprised that we have not.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious to understand what it is about Michigan specifically that makes you talk about the Shia population there. I'm guessing that they have a larger Shia population than other
Yes.
states, but
Yeah,
anything
yeah.
more you could
There's
share?
a very large, yeah, there's a very large population, Muslim population in Michigan, and again, others know more about this than I do, but the Shiite element in that population, I think, is particularly concentrated in and around Dearborn, Michigan. Um, so, and God bless them. That's a wonderful place to go if you're looking, for Lebanese delicacies. But yeah, that's where they have a particularly large um, population, and one which actually, among other things, is politically significant.
Right. And there's so much more we could discuss, but I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through some of what we are seeing unfold and to think through what may happen in the days ahead. Bob Grenier, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Good. And for everybody who's been watching, we appreciate you being here. Share this with people who are interested in the topic, who want to learn. It's an important conversation that is exploring the policies, the people, the priorities, the problems. So, on that note, take care and everybody stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.